All right, welcome to the Week 12 Forum. This week we are taking a hard look at America's history of terrorism. Uh, I perceive a tendency among Americans to become indignant when you start picking out events from America's history. In Martin's case, he picked out our dark history of lynching blacks and other minorities at the start of the chapter, and then characterized them as terrorism. We tend to have a little bit of a blind spot, and my students have, kind of evinced this blind spot when I've taught this course in the past. Why do you think Americans tend to gloss over this aspect of their own history? I think it's clear that lynchings were, fit most categories of terrorism. I would argue that it was establishment terrorism. When historically sophisticated Americans do acknowledge terrorism, they tend to focus on hippies and yippies from the 1960s and 70s, when groups like the Weathermen and the Symbionese Liberation Army and Charles Manson's family were robbing banks, assassinating police, and planting bombs in symbolically important sites. Um, my interpretation of Martin in this chapter is that America has deep well springs of radicalism on both the left and the right that periodically originate homegrown terrorism. And the two ends of the ideological spectrum often interact with one another, goading one another along. Then you have the problem with radical ideas periodically imported into the country that ignite domestic terrorism. But we shouldn't be under any illusions. There's plenty of radical kindling in American political culture just waiting to be, uh, you know, ignited and brought into action. I would also note that while America was born in an active political dissidence, the roots of right-wing radicalism in the United States are likely run a bit deeper. In contrast, America's radical left has often drawn a bit more heavily on immigrants and leftist ideology. I would hate to say that we would characterize it as imported, but I think it is. While there are a few American Marxists, most avowed socialists have come to this country from Europe, Asia, countries like Germany, Italy, other European nations. I'm not declaring that socialism in general or Marxism in particular are in any way un-American. But what I am saying is that American political culture emphasizes individualism to an extent that most Americans do tend to view socialism as kind of an alien ideology. Um, Table 12.2 on page 316 charts the groups most responsible for terrorist attacks in the 10-year period between 2001 and 2011. In it, you can see that the two most active groups were actually the Earth Liberation Front, ELF, and the Animal Liberation Front, ALF, whose attacks constitute about 87% of all terrorist attacks in the United States, mostly bombings of property and doing other kinds of acts of sabotage. Likewise, when you look at, of course, the body count, Al Qaeda's 4 attacks accounted for nearly 3,000 fatalities in a very limited number of attacks. So obviously, that's the thing when you're looking at tracking incidents of terrorism. There's counting things, and then there's things that count. Okay. When looking at the origins of left-wing American terrorism, the rise of the Black Power movement is one that I find interesting. Most Americans tend to view African Americans' assertion of political rights through the lens of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Many Americans admired the restraint and the commitment to collective nonviolence or nonviolent confrontation as one of the most successful dissident movements in American history. But there was a parallel set of movements, including the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, and the Black Muslim movement, that was far more, dare I say it, violent, far more willing to resort to violence in the defense of African Americans against the state. Something that is not in the text but I find very interesting is the Black Power advocates began carrying rifles in public, moving in armed groups to defend their neighborhoods. California, then dominated by the Republican Party, quickly passed what they called open carry laws, banning the open display of guns after Huey Newton and other Black Panthers invaded the California General Assembly armed with rifles. In 1967, the NRA supported the ban on openly carrying loaded weapons in public. I wonder why. In many ways, the rise of the new left in the United States was typical of the kinds of left-wing Marxist-oriented groups that predominated in the United States and Western Europe in the 1960s and 70s, you can see a pattern. Young, idealistic, impatient college students, such as the Students for a Democratic Society, they meet, they have a few beers, they announce the Port Huron statement that the establishment is corrupt and should get out of the way of the nation's youth so that they can take the helm. The Democratic establishment, still dominated by craggy old machine politicians and union leaders, whose leadership had little patience for that flavor of Western Marxism drifting around U.S. universities at the time, first tries to ignore groups like SDS and then just decidedly just turns on them and squashes them in the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Young kids nursing cracked skulls radicalize and relaunch as the Weathermen, seeking through revolution what they couldn't achieve through agitation. You may detect a little bit of a note of cynicism regarding how I view some of these folks like Tom Hayden and people like that. Martin cites a number of interesting examples of left-wing terrorism. Again, there's a lot of history in these chapters that we need to try and be aware of. Some of you may be aware that several groups advocating Puerto Rican independence have engaged in terrorism in the United States, including an assault on Blair House, which at the time was where Harry Truman was staying. It occurred on November 1st, 1950. The White House was being substantially renovated at the time. And then on March 1st, 1954, 4 Puerto Rican nationalists opened fire on members of the House of Representatives from the visitors' galley in the House of Representatives chambers and actually wounded 5 members. I also think that Martin's discussion of eco-terrorism is noteworthy, given again that members of ALF and ELF are currently the most prolific domestic terrorists, committing by far the most numerous attacks, which are often described as ecotage. Mostly bombings and sabotage of laboratories, breaking into labs and releasing animals and things like that. Other environmental groups have engaged in spiking of old-growth trees with the purpose of destroying logging equipment with the potential for inflicting life-threatening wounds to loggers themselves. How would you gauge the threat of eco-terrorism as a domestic threat, as a threat to the American state? Martin's discussion of right-wing activism and ideological extremism is, I think, fairly riveting. It should not come as a surprise that Christian fundamentalism has inspired a great deal of extremism. Likewise, in the early 1990s, it's seen a rise of anti-government patriot movements and militias. I actually worked in a used and collectible bookstore in the mid-1990s, and the guy that ran the location where I worked was a so-called patriot. He was, needless to say, an interesting guy for a grad student studying terrorism to talk to. He ultimately moved to Michigan and joined a militia movement up there, and I think got himself arrested. The incidents at Ruby Ridge and Waco both involved well-armed anti-government fanatics. The standoff at Ruby Ridge began with an illegal weapons charge after Randy Weaver sold an undercover ATF agent an illegally modified shotgun. ATF agents approached the Weaver compound near Naples, Idaho, were discovered when the Weaver's dogs began barking and began retreating. But Weaver's son and a family friend went armed into the yard, and a gunfight resulted, which killed a U.S. Marshal and Weaver's son. A subsequent siege resulted in Weaver's wife, Victoria's, death by sniper fire. Likewise, the Waco incident began with an attempt to serve a warrant for illegal weapons charges and resulted in 4 federal agents being gunned down by, again, a very heavily armed Branch Davidian cult. In a bid to end the standoff, Attorney General Janet Reno authorized an assault on the compound, which subsequently caught fire by suspicious means. A number of people have declared that they believe that federal agents set the fire. Other people believe that the Branch Davidians themselves set the fire. In any event, roughly 80 cult members, including 20 children, died in the fire. It was not a bright, shining moment in law enforcement. One commonality that seems to unite fringe figures from the left and the right is the belief in conspiracies. Right-wing extremists tend to be extremely fond of conspiracy theories, and we have even seen some Republican candidates for federal office who espouse some of these beliefs. Republican Representative Steve King, who has a long history of making bizarre, racist, and homophobic statements, including once expressing empathy for Andrew Joseph Stack, who piloted a single passenger airplane into a multi-purpose building that housed the IRS in Austin, Texas. If you look this guy up and look at some of his quotes, I mean, you can tell for yourself what kind of belief system he seems to be drawing on. Racism is often a strong motivating force with American right-wing extremism. One group that synthesizes a lot of the different strands of right-wing extremism is the Christian identity movement, which originated as a strain of the British Israelism. I don't want to get too far in the theology of this stuff. And in America, mutated into anti-Semitic, racist, and white supremacist kind of synthesis of Christianity that no Christian sect is prepared to acknowledge. Adherents are most often found in the Pacific Northwest and in the Midwest. They argue that Aryans are favored by God and everyone else are mud people who lack souls. What are your thoughts about Christian identity? Why do movements like this form? How do they sustain themselves? No discussion of American right-wing terrorism would be complete without at least mentioning the Ku Klux Klan, which was conceived as a terrorist organization dedicated to the continued subordination and oppression of newly freed African Americans and the continued political and economic suzerainty of Southern whites. They wielded real power and influence in the Deep South and neighboring states, including Oklahoma, well into the mid-20th century. There was a time when you literally could not get elected in states like Alabama, South Carolina, and West Virginia without being a member of the Klan. That Martin categorizes the Klan's history into 5 distinct eras suggests something important about the power and durability of racism in American politics in general and in Southern politics in particular. Are any of you interested in the history of the Klan as a terrorist organization? How did the Klan operate in its heyday? How has the Klan evolved to adapt itself to an environment that's less tolerant of overt expressions of racism? The remainder of the chapter details the numerous manifestations of right-wing inspired violence, and there's simply a lot of it. If there's anything that really leaps out at you that you want to discuss, let's throw it out there and see what we have, what interests us. The last section of the chapter, Martin details the spillover effect in the United States as international terrorism occurs increasingly within our borders. This is our lived history from the 9/11 attacks to the more recent lone wolf attacks. Before 2001, the main spillovers were Puerto Rican nationalists, anti-Castro Cuban groups like Omega 7, who wanted the U.S. to go in and invade and expel Fidel Castro. Likewise, the Irish Republican Army did a lot of business in the United States, getting cash and weapons from Irish Americans on the East Coast. So, based on what we've learned in this chapter, what's the most serious problem? What are the most serious problems? Left-wing terrorism or right-wing terrorism? Which would you estimate is the most numerous and well-organized? Which doctrine do you view as the most pernicious, and why? So hopefully this gives you plenty of guidance and the issues to discuss. As always, let me know what jumps out at you, from the chapter. What are the most important insights you learned in the chapter? What part of the chapter did you struggle to understand? Let's talk it over.